This is the beginning of an interview with Mr. Charles Marion Coe. Mr. Coe is a veteran of World War II, where he served in the 92nd Field Artillery Battalion of the U.S. Army. This interview is being conducted at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Frederick Wallace. I am the interviewer. Mr. Coe, this is your opportunity to tell your story about your military experience. And you want to share this with the American people and with your family. So this is your opportunity, Mr. Coe. This is your story. And we will begin by asking you, what made you want to join the military?
Well, we lived in West Lafayette, where Purdue University is located, and they had an excellent ROTC program there. So it was only a natural thing to want to join because of their reputation and the opportunity to provide good physical and mental training and well-being, as well as a patriotic thing to do.
How did you choose the Army over another branch of the armed forces?
The only branch that Purdue had there was the Army branch field artillery. That's all they taught in ROTC there. So it was just a natural thing to do.
Did you need any specific background or qualification to join the Army?
Well, you had to be a high school graduate and be willing to take some tough training and take orders and eventually give orders yourself properly. You had to have good grades and good physical condition.
What was your reaction when you were first called up to duty?
Well, I felt it was my duty, and but leaving the family was for an uncertain future was not easy, and I didn't realize then I'd be gone for 4 years. But I felt it was my duty and should make the best of it.
I'm going to ask you to describe your training for us. Where were you stationed? Where were you stationed initially, and when?
I was called in February of '42 and sent to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a little town there called Southern Pines. And General George Patton was our chief there, and was a real rough and tough leader. And we had basic exercises, lots of close order drill, lots of marching, and training in field artillery maintenance and use of small arms, and on the range we had the 105 millimeter training, which meant forward observers would go out and find a target, and we'd fire a round to locate somewhere near the target and adjust for that and finally fire for effect, and get the training that was needed for the future war.
Let me ask you a couple of questions for clarification.
Yes.
You said that General George Patton
Yes,
was the chief.
he was.
What does that mean? Was he the commander of
He was
the
the
post?
commander of the post and of our 2nd Armored Division. He was the commander, and he would give talks to all of us, and the GIs just loved to hear him talk because he would inspire them, and but he was a rough talker.
And this was in Fort Bragg?
At Fort Bragg, yes. He would say things like, until you've ground the blood and guts of the enemy in your wheels and your half-track of your tanks, you haven't begun to fight. So he talked rough and got the guys pretty inspired, and
Now, is
Young
Fort
Street.
Bragg where you went through basic training?
Yes,
That was boot camp?
yes.
And you stayed there for your artillery training? Or did you go to
Yes.
another post?
We started the artillery training there, and then about the time that they went on maneuvers, I was pulled out and sent to New York to the FM labs at Bell Labs because they needed someone to learn about the new FM radios, the frequency modulated radios, which we would be using in our tanks and half-tracks and for all of our communications in World War II. It was new. We always had AM amplitude
Modulation.
modulation in the past, but this was new, and somebody had to learn it and teach the other officers how to use the radios and maintain them. So they sent me to Bell Lab School for a month while the other Second Armored Division was on maneuvers. So I missed the maneuvers, but I got good training on what to do when we were in the war.
Let's go back to Fort Bragg again.
All right.
What was the most difficult thing about your training at Fort Bragg?
I believe the most difficult was learning, I say left from right, because I could stand up and show you, but for example, if you got a bunch of troops in front of you and you're going to command them to do close order drill, and you tell them you want them to go that way, so you say right face, but you better turn left, because when you say march, they'll be going that way and you'll be going that way. And all of our drilling was, you have to do it backwards. If you say right, you got to show them this, and this. When you exercise, if you say left, you go this way. Everything is reverse, because they'll follow you. They won't all listen to you, because those in the rear can't hear you. So when you're demonstrating and exercising and so forth, everything's in reverse, because you're facing them, and that's the only way to do it.
So you were a leader
That was
of
hard
the
to do.
group.
Yes.
How did you get that position?
I guess when you're an officer, you inherit that. You just have to do it. That's part of being an officer's job.
I thought you were enlisted.
No, I went in as an officer.
You went in as an
Yes,
officer.
I went in
Oh,
as a-
okay, good. I'm glad
I
we
went in as a
clarified
first
that.
lieutenant,
Uh-huh.
and sometime during the war, I think about the time we hit England, I was made a captain.
Okay, very good. Were you discouraged during any part of your training?
Oh yeah, very many times, but you just can't show it, because then it would affect the morale of the troops. So you just couldn't show that you had any problems whatsoever. You had to act like everything was going to be cheery and rosy, and we were going to win all the time, even though you never knew for sure. We assumed we'd have no casualties, but we knew we'd have some.
Did you consider being an officer easier in the military than being an enlisted man? Was it an easier life?
In some respects, it's easier, yes, but the stress and responsibilities that are extra, sometimes you wonder whether it's worth it, because you didn't get a whole lot of increased pay over enlisted men. I think a captain's pay was $150 a month, and I don't know what enlisted men were, but probably 100. There's not a lot of difference. So it's debatable whether it's worth it money-wise, but from the standpoint of doing your job, if you could do a better job as an officer, then that's what you should do.
Good. Can you describe your assignment after your training was complete?
Well, to some degree, yes. The most difficult thing was trying to teach the other officers how to use the FM communications properly, and the other problem was how to maintain them, because this was all new, and very few people had any experience. So what we told them, that was it. We had circuit diagrams. We had a maintenance crew that learned pretty quickly. But things like telling the officers, you push a button on the mic and it'll operate if you talk into it properly. But when you're in a tank and it's noisy, like our colonel would frequently do, he'd lay the mic down on his seat and then sit on it, and of course it would be operating and he wouldn't know it, and no one else could talk because this was sending out all these signals. And we wondered what was wrong. Well, somebody would have to run up to the tank and say like this, and finally he'd raise up and the mic would stop and we'd get it straightened out. But things like that you can't predict until it occurs. Anyway, teaching the other officers how to use the communications, and these are all direct line of sight, just like our cell phones are today. But back then, remember, there's no TV. We didn't have any TVs. Didn't have any cell phones, nothing like that. But we were using that basic concept back then, this direct line of sight communications. But I enjoyed teaching them, and we had a good maintenance crew. They kept the equipment running, and except for those few times when the colonel would sit on the mic, why, everything worked out very well.
At what point did you get word that you were going to ship overseas and that you would be in combat?
Right after maneuvers, they said we'd be heading for some point, and but they didn't tell us where until we were on the ship, and then we were told it would be North Africa. They didn't want to let the word out. If somebody tell the family, hey, we're going to North Africa, then those people in North Africa, the Germans, would know about it sooner or later. So after we were on shipboard, then we were told our destination would be North Africa. So right after maneuvers, we were told.
And did you at that time think that going into war was necessary?
Oh, definitely. Yes, definitely. I believe Germans had been fighting for at least a year or so, and I know they'd been bombing England, bombing Britain, and yes, it was obvious that we were going to have to do something about it, do our best to stop them.
How did you feel about the Germans?
Well, I didn't hate them until Patton talked to us, and we began to hate the German soldiers. We didn't hate the German people, but we sure hated the German soldiers and Hitler and his SS troops. And we had to develop that in order to kill them before they killed us. They had to have that attitude. You just had to.
So how did you feel about the skills that you had developed that they would be used to kill people?
We had to depend on our skills and keep improving them in order to kill them before they killed us. Darn right.
Did you think Germans were good soldiers?
Oh, definitely. Yes, they were very good. And we respected them, and I think they respected us. They respected our firepower. The motto of the 2nd Armored Division was held on wheels, you know. And they could sure had a lot of firepower. They just about just wipe out a city in a few minutes. But our battalion had 18 105mm howitzers with a range of about 8 or 9 miles. And there were 3 battalions, so that made 56 105mm howitzers mounted on tank chassis. And it was a devastating firepower, just devastating. Then we had the 37mm and a 50 caliber, which is our most common
That's the machine gun.
machine gun, yes.
Okay.
And it's kind of interesting in that every fifth or sixth bullet had phosphorus in it, so it would be a red tracer following it. And the Germans had white tracers. And so at night we could always tell where they were because they had the white tracers. And we could always tell where we were because we had the red tracers. Because the lines are never like the map showed. The lines are always like this. But even though we said, here's where the Germans are, here's where we are. But there are never perfect maps. You just had to experience where they were.
Was that the purpose of including the phosphorus in the
Yes,
shells?
yes,
So
And
that one,
they-
you could distinguish
yes.
who was doing the shooting?
Absolutely. That's very important.
Where were you located? Where was the fighting taking place when you first got there?
In North Africa, there was very little because they, I guess they heard we were coming and left only a little bit of resistance to wipe out Casablanca and Rabat and one other, Port Lyotte, I think it's called. But anyway, in North Africa on the west coast, we hit there in just before Christmas of '42, and General Rommel of the German army was retreating just about the same time we got there. So it didn't take long to get him to move out and head towards the other part of Africa. And we occupied those cities within just a matter of hours. And then it was kind of interesting in that we'd always taught our men to dig foxholes. And in the sand of North Carolina, it was pretty easy to dig those foxholes. But in rock and clay, like we have here around Georgia, it's pretty hard to dig. And but they did their best, and it was a good thing they did. They followed orders, dug a hole so we could get them in case we were bombed. And sure enough, the day after we got there on the 24th, and Christmas Eve, they bombed us. And they just bombed the heck out of us, and all of the shells, fragments went over us. And we were in holes, so no one got injured at all. Not a single death or injury. Just from following orders.
Were you scared during this?
Darn right it was, but I couldn't show it. You just didn't let the fellows know you just, you were brave and nothing bothered you. But you were scared, sure. We prayed every night, every day. You bet. You had to. You better.
And what were the sleeping conditions like, the living conditions?
Well, they were usually, ground was usually pretty hard and cold, but you get used to it. I always thought my grandfather, who fought in the Civil War, was pretty crazy when he talked about sleeping on the ground for 3 years. And I ended up doing the same thing. We always had enough blankets or rubber and insulators and so forth between us and the ground that it didn't bother us too much. They had good bedding equipment, a lot of wool, a lot of blankets, a lot of tent covers to keep it waterproof and so forth.
Were you in sort of a camp area, or were you just out in the
Sometimes
field?
we'd be in a camp area, but usually you're right out in the open, usually. Because you're moving too often to get any stabilized camp conditions. You're just moving most of the time.
How did you move?
We were in half tracks and jeeps, and of course the firing batteries were in their tanks and tanks. I should have said, I want to correct that. Their 105s were mounted on tank chassis, so they were open. But the firing crews would move in those in half tracks and jeeps, same thing as us, but they had the 105 millimeters besides.
You seem to be distinguishing between the firing crews and
Oh, yes.
your group.
Yeah, I
Can you
was in
tell me what the
headquarters.
difference is?
I was the headquarters battery commander,
Okay.
And we had the Fire Direction Center there so that we'd coordinate all of our fire direction depending on who we were supporting. If the infantry wanted us to support them, then we'd have one of our forward observers with the infantry. Then we'd have another forward observer in a Cub plane in the daytime, looking around, trying to see their targets so that we could support the infantry and wipe out whatever was bothering, whatever was holding them up. And so if we were supporting a tank outfit, then we'd have one of our forward observers in a tank with the tank outfit that was doing the attacking, so they could support them, wipe out whoever was interfering with their attack.
And did you feel that this was an essential part of the combat?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's you had to have very, very accurate fire direction coordinates. We had to know exactly where we were all the time, and we had a very good reconnaissance group. And this happened to be a professor from Purdue who was over our reconnaissance. He's a civil engineering professor, and at night we had to find out where we were, and he'd when he could see through the clouds and see any star, he'd get a reading on it, and then he could tell exactly where we were. And by doing that, then we could pinpoint where we were so that we could attack the enemy and know exactly where we could place our shells. See, it's kind of complicated. I can't explain it very clearly, but accuracy of our location was extremely important, and of course knowing where the enemy was.
So you had to know
just
where
as
you
important.
were.
Sure. It's you might say that it was so important that if you didn't know where you were and you fired a shell out there, you could hit some of your own troops. That's the key. I'll give you an example of that. One of the things that we didn't, I'm getting ahead of my story, I'm getting into the time we were in France.
Well,
So
before you
better
get
back
there,
up.
yeah, before you get there, during the time that you were in Africa, how long were you there in Africa?
Just almost a year, but not quite. Seeming like about 9 months, but I'm not sure the time element. I've got it recorded here someplace. Because our next target was Sicily, and we went from West Africa to Iran, and from Iran to Bizerte, and from there we went by ship to Sicily, and from there to England. And it didn't take long to take Sicily, about a month and a half, and then we went to England next.
Well, since you were in the headquarters company,
Yes.
were you subjected to hostile fire?
Yes, but not as much as the firing batteries.
Okay.
Yes.
Were you wounded?
We tried to stay back of the firing batteries a little ways. For just we had to be, we had to coordinate all the fire for the firing batteries, so naturally we would stay to the rear a little bit. They would be within 7 to 9 miles of the front all the time.
Did you sustain any wounds in
No,
combat?
Unfortunately, we had, I guess, about a dozen wounded. One of them was just one of our own errors, where the Jeep driver happened to drive at night and he hit a shell hole, and it dumped the officer out and broke his leg, so he was out of commission for the rest of the war. But most of the wounds were minor. We had we had 6, I believe. 1, 2, 3. No, we had 5 killed in action. 1 officer and 4 enlisted men.
And this was when you were in Africa?
No, this was in France and Germany.
Okay.
Six total, but 5 were due to enemy action.
Okay, then take us from Germany now.
All right, we want to start at D-Day or where?
What was the next place that you went to after you left North Africa?
Oh yeah, we went to England for training for D-Day, and we were there almost a year. It was very, very strenuous training, and we got a break now and then. We even started a dance band to get the fellows' mind, jazz band I should call it, get the fellows' mind off of just a war training all the time, get a little entertainment. Because I don't remember ever seeing a USO troop there, but there may have been one time, but I don't recall it. But we started a band just to get the guys for entertainment, you know. Get
Where in England were you?
Southern England near Salisbury, close to the Salisbury Plains, where we did our practice firing and so forth.
And what did this training consist of?
Well, mainly improving our accuracy and trying out this new fuse that we had. It's called proximity fuse. We call it PROSIT for short, and it was very effective. It's one thing we had that the Germans didn't have. You see, when you're in a foxhole and the shell explodes over here, the fragments go over you. But we had a shell that went into the nose of this 105 millimeter. It's called proximity, and when you'd fire over the enemy, when it came within about 15 to 20 feet of the ground, it would explode. And so it was devastating because it'd get in the foxhole if they weren't covered up. So it wiped out a lot of German troops. That was really a wonderful invention. Otherwise, if you use armored piercing, that wouldn't do any good. That would just go in the ground and explode. You wouldn't wipe out many people doing that. But when it exploded above the ground, it really wiped out a lot of people.
And after your training was complete in England, what happened? Where did you go?
Well then, we prepared for D-Day and got on these LSTs, and it was quite a sight. There were ships in all directions, and we went into D+2 and D+3, and unfortunately I think they figured about 10,000 troops were killed on D-Day itself. And that was one horrible experience to see those bodies floating around in the ocean just before we hit the shore at Omaha Beach. Pretty sickening.
So you landed at Omaha
We
Beach?
landed at Omaha Beach, yes. And by that time, by D+2 and 3, we could get up fairly close so that we didn't have to get out into the salt water. We could get out fairly close to the beach. They'd already cleared most of the landmines and most of the big obstacles that kept the ships from going ashore. And the shore batteries had been silenced. They'd wiped out most of them. So we didn't have too much resistance. We'd get a plane coming over once in a while dropping a bomb, but not too often. So we got in there pretty quickly until we got in about 20 miles, and then their fortifications were very, very strong. I don't believe I have a picture of it, but
When you
German
say 20
McNair.
miles after you hit the beach?
Yes, after we hit the beach. After
Okay.
about a week or two, we came to an area where they just seemed to couldn't advance because the German 88 millimeters. I have a picture of them someplace. These were very, very powerful and potent weapons. Well, I don't see one. Anyway, they would penetrate our tank's armor. And we were losing so many tanks that the General McNair decided that we should, here's one, shows it in downtown Berlin, 88 millimeter.
Let me
Ours were-
find that.
And they could penetrate our tank's armor and just stop our tanks with one direct hit. And so our tankers started putting on sandbags and armor, extra armor, everything they could to try to stop it. But anyway, to make a long story short, General McNair said, we're having so many casualties, we're going to call in the Air Force, we're going to have a 20-mile strip completely obliterated. We want it wiped out, bomb them, so there's nothing left there. So they called in the bombers and they did that. And the only catch was that he wanted to, I guess, show he was brave. So he was up fairly close to the front lines where this would start, where the bombing would start. Let's say within a mile or two of it.
Is this the general you're talking
General
about?
McNair. And so they started doing that, and they wiped out everything. And all of a sudden, the wind changed and started blowing the smoke towards us. And the last bombers then dropped it on General McNair, and killed him and the people with him. So we had some casualties from our own bombers because of miscalculation. Didn't figure out, didn't we depended on wind not changing, things like that. So we had some casualties that hurt real bad. But it worked. His decision to wipe out 20 miles of everything worked. And we were able to go right on and attack, keep right on moving then, because of his decision to wipe out everything for 20 miles. So it did pay off.
Can you describe what a typical day was like?
Well, yes, try. A typical day would be fighting, because that's what we did most of the time. And we had 3 firing batteries. Of course, 3 battalions did the same thing. One of those would be firing and supporting whatever infantry or tanks, whatever it was attacking. And that's all they'd be doing. Another one would be moving to do the same thing. Another would be recuperating, maintaining, and so forth. So we always had 1 firing, 1 moving, 1 ready. And the other battalions did the same thing. So it depends on whether you were in A battery, B battery, C battery, it depend on what they were doing at the time. And of course, headquarters had to be responsible for all 3 of them. So we were always busy, all the time. But if there's any lull in the activity and firing, then of course headquarters battery moved in. Now let's take a typical day. It was raining. It rained, I swear, 7 days out of 7. But once in a while, it would clear up. The sun would come out. And I believe the Germans appreciated the sun as much as we did. They just quit fighting, and everyone would start drying out. And you just hang your wet clothes up on a line and on the half track and all over, look like a bunch of gypsies, I suppose, and dry out. And appreciate sun and life, a little bit of quiet for a change. But most of the time, it was raining, we were fighting most of the time.
How far were you from the German lines? Could you see the Germans?
Occasionally, we didn't want to see them too often, because they could see us. And but we're usually back around 7 to 10 miles, usually. We never knew for sure where they were, but they usually have someone within that range, 7 to 10 miles. You might say that that's one of the reasons we didn't allow any smoking at night, because you'd light up a cigarette and a sharpshooter over there could see and it could kill you pretty easily. They had excellent telescopes, excellent sights, excellent guns, and so you didn't allow any smoking.
So at night, what did you do at night? In your area, in the cantonment area where you were?
We would try to get a little rest, but you'd hear our bombers go over at night, because we had, I believe the Germans were more worried about our bombing than we were, because we had air superiority. We couldn't have won the war without air superiority, I don't believe. But the Germans would try to sleep, I'm sure, like we were trying to at night. But the Americans, bombers would usually go over at night, and then the British would bomb them in the daytime. So they didn't get much rest.
And in your area, you said that you couldn't strike a match or light a cigarette.
No, you wouldn't want to do that.
Okay, how did you get around? How could you see where you were going? You had flashlights?
You did, yeah, very carefully. You'd have some flashlights, but you put a red cover over them so you couldn't see it. The Jeeps, if you traveled at night, they had little night lights. They just kind of glowed in the dark. And you just depend on moonlight to move forward. You just couldn't use any headlights whatsoever, because it'd be too dangerous. Now, way back in the rear, of course, they could use, that service battery. We could use lights in the rear. 20 miles back, that wouldn't be so bad. But you just couldn't use any lights at night.
How many troops did you have within your group, in your battalion?
Roughly 100, little over 100 in headquarters, a little over 100 in each of the firing batteries, and 100 in the service battery. So it made about 500 total. So I think it's about 550 total in our battalion. We had 3 battalions, and I think the division had around 3,000 people total in the Second Army Division, approximately 3,000.
What do you feel was the most memorable thing that happened to you?
Well, several things. Of course, winning the war was the biggest thrill, just getting it over with. I believe that one of the memorable things was going through the cities that we'd liberate, and this would be an example. Maastricht, Holland. Those people had come out of holes in the ground and air raid shelters. I don't know where they all came from, but they came out and gave us a V for victory sign, and they'd have flowers and bread and this one, since we camped there at Maastricht then for about a week or so, the people started up their factory, and they made this what do you call it, blue
Delft Blau?
Delft, yeah. They made this famous plate, and it says, for the liberation of Maastricht by the Americans in 14th of September 1944. This is typical of the towns that were liberated. They appreciated us coming in and doing that, really appreciated it, because they'd been dominated by a pretty tough German regime for years, and that made it worthwhile for us to come through and be appreciated by the people we liberated.
So At what point did you get to Holland?
This was after going through France. Holland was next, and then Belgium. And of course, Belgium was tough because it was getting to be winter when we got to Belgium, and that's where we had the Battle of the Bulge. And that was pretty rugged because it was cold, and it's hard to fight when you're freezing at night. It's just very difficult. The Germans had made last ditch effort to penetrate our lines. They actually got clear through with tanks, and also they'd gotten through by somehow they'd gotten our code. We had codes every day. We had a different code, so that if someone traveled at night, you better know the right code or you're liable to get shot. Well, apparently they had broken that code and found out what it was, and so they had come through with half-track and an ambulance and a jeep leading a bunch of Americans, some of our vehicles. I don't know how they got them, but they did, and there were Germans in our vehicles. A few of them could speak a little English, and but they'd gotten through our lines, and about the second time they pulled us, I guess we got wise, and our sentries started asking them questions like, what's the Big Apple? And if they didn't give the right city, they just shoot them. And I know one column we saw them completely wiped out, and because they were Germans in American vehicles. I don't know how they got them, but they did. They had an ambulance, a big red cross on the front, and it looked like our vehicles, and there was a bunch of Germans in our
But you managed to get through Belgium.
yeah. The Second Armored came up from one direction, and I believe it was the first came from another direction. We just cut them off, and were able to stop their supplies. And then the tanks that were ahead were a problem, and that's where one of our officers was awarded a Silver Star. It was at night, and he was supposed to be supporting our tanks. And this is a guy named Captain Moyer. And he'd stopped for the night, and for some reason, when they moved, when the tanks he was supporting moved, they forgot to tell him that they were going to move at a certain location. And he was just sitting there sleeping overnight. And all of a sudden he heard a lot of tank engines, and he opened the hatch and listened again. It didn't sound like our tanks. And he kept listening, and finally heard some Germans talking in German. So he knew he was in trouble. There were a bunch of German tanks all around him. So he closed it up and called for our fire direction center. And he said, "I'm at such and such a location. Do you know where I am?" And they said, "Yeah, we know where you are." He said, "Well, get all the firing batteries ready and fire on me." So we got our 6, 12, 18 guns, howitzers, and fired on him as fast as we could. And after about 15 minutes, he said, "Cease fire." He was still alive. And he said, we'd wiped out 2 or 3 of the tanks, and one was disabled. 2 or 3 of them were burning. And he was awarded the Silver Star for that, because, and the funny part about it is that we missed him, and we were firing right on him. But we're just not that accurate, see? Or else the Lord was on our side. But
The Lord was on his
It had
side.
to be. Yeah, he got a Silver Star for that.
Well, I would say he deserved it.
He sure did. One other time he was in a Cub plane as an observer, and he saw a bunch of Germans retreating and getting in a boat to go across the, I think it was the Elbe River, I could be wrong. It's either the Elbe or Rhine. Anyway, he saw him from the Cub airplane getting on the boat, trying to get across the river. So he called for our firing batteries to fire on that boat. And of course he had to keep trying to fire ahead as the boat moved across the river. My gosh, we got shells in the boat, sunk the whole boat. So he got I think he got a Silver Star for that also. Anyway, we had some good times, good luck too.
What were the times that you feel that you, how can I say this, that you did not like very well?
Well, I guess you might say the times that where we had some casualties. We'd try to review what happened, what happened, and how could we avoided it. And some of them you just can't explain. You cannot see how we could have avoided it. I was put on special duty. I'll give you an example. Right at the end of the war, our division artillery colonel said, you're going to have to get that orchestra going again. These guys are going to need entertainment in Berlin. We're going to be there just as soon as the Russians go in Berlin, sometime in the next few weeks, because the war was practically over, very little resistance. He said, get that band going again. And I said, well, we don't have all the instruments, don't have music, don't have this, that, and the other. He said, I don't want excuses, just do it. So I got the crew together again and found out what was needed and flew back to Brussels, Belgium in our Cub plane and got music and a few instruments that we were short on and prepared to rehearse as soon as we got to Berlin. And about that time we got the okay. See, they had an agreement between Truman or Roosevelt, and he died. So Truman and Stalin had an agreement that the Russians would go to Berlin first. So after they got to Berlin, then we went to Berlin. Second Armored Division was the first troops in. And there were a bunch of German youth that were firing on our troops even after the hostilities had ceased, but they were still firing on our troops. So they said, they asked our 92nd to go down and wipe them out, whatever it took. So Sergeant Davis and a crew got in a tank and went down to do that. Well, Sergeant Davis was in headquarters, and he was in communications, so he wasn't as familiar with tank operations as he should have been. And unfortunately, when they fired at the house where these youth were firing, sharpshooting and so forth, firing at our troops.
Were they German soldiers?
Apparently not. Apparently just youth, German youth.
Just kids.
I forget what they call them, but
Hitlerjungen?
yeah, something like that. Yeah. They fired a couple of rounds, and then there was a miscommunications in the tank, and this sergeant started to move across the other side for some reason, and just that time they fired one more shell, and a recoil killed him, just like that.
Killed the sergeant?
Killed the sergeant. Now that sort of thing, you wonder, how could that happen? Why would it happen? What should we have done to prevent it? Well, that communication sergeant shouldn't have been in there in the first place, see. And of course my excuse is that I was on special duty, I was not headquarters battery commander then, or I might have stopped, might have not let him do that. But the fellow who took my place didn't think about that, let him do that as
Was that your biggest regret?
so I have regrets, things like that, you know. Yeah. One of our forward observers was killed in action, and I regretted that, but that's those things happen. Lieutenant Gazone, he was just doing his job, and he got killed. We had another one killed by a bomb, another one killed by enemy fire. But we were fortunate. We only had about five, as I say, five killed in action.
So during your tour in the Army, you traveled from North Africa, and we are now in Belgium and going into Holland
Yes, and
You-
then on into Berlin.
and on into Berlin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I left out something here. I think it's kind of interesting to mention. When we went from Africa to Sicily, and then we were going to go to England, but you'll see that the route shows us going 2/3 of the way back to the United States.
Hmm.
And that was to confuse the Germans, to make them think the 2nd Armored Division was going to be taken out of service after we accomplished taking over North Africa and Sicily, that we'd be taken out of service. So we went 2/3 of the way to back to the United States and back again to England, then turned around, came back. And just before we got to port in England, Bull Manure Betty, the girl from Berlin that was on the German radio, announced in English, "Welcome back, 2nd Armored Division." We've done all of that, the whole division and all those ships went back 2/3 of the way back to the United States, and then went back to England to confuse the Germans. They welcomed us back. They knew we were
And
back.
you were there.
I think that's kind of interesting.
On the map, the big map that you have there,
Yes.
show us what that's about.
Well, you can see where we had D-Day right over there on the left. And
Mhm.
we went through, across this river here, and into Belgium, and then Holland, somewhere in here is Maastricht. Right in there is Maastricht. And all of these were very, very strong campaigns, where the Germans were pretty well set up to pretty high resistance, I should say. But over here in Germany then, it was even worse, because they were fighting this is their last chance to keep us out. But even here, it was sporadic, because I think they knew that they had already lost the war. We were this far along. We were capturing a lot of prisoners, as you can see here.
So after Holland, you continued on to Germany?
Oh yes, all the way to Berlin. Yes.
What do you feel is your biggest contribution to the war? Or your most important contribution, let me say that.
Well, just winning the war is the biggest contribution, and liberating the people who had been oppressed by the Germans for so many years. I think we,
I'm speaking of you as an individual.
as an individual.
Yes.
Oh, excuse me. I think as an individual, I demanded the top skill from the personnel under me, and top attitude, and the best ability that they could summon from their experience and from their training. And they sure performed the very best, the very best.
So you were very pleased with
Quite
your
pleased,
service?
You bet. Quite proud of them. Yeah.
Mhm.
Might mention a couple of things that happened during the war and right afterwards. Chaplain Walsted was our division chaplain, and he'd come by maybe once a month for church services. And he was a Lutheran chaplain from Brooklyn, New York. and we'd allow maybe 25 soldiers to get in a big tent, and we'd have church services. Any more than that would be dangerous. But he'd do this about once a month. And after the war then, we were good friends. We made a trip up to Wittenberg, Germany, which is in the Russian zone. And there at Wittenberg is where Martin Luther broke away from the Catholic Church, and he has his thesis printed on the door of the church. So it was an honor just to be with him and see what that was. Even though it was in German, he interpreted and told me what it was all about. I can't think of anything else.
I see you have the decoration there, or a
Yes,
cross.
it's
It looks
kind of
like.
interesting. It's one
What
of
is
Hitler's
that?
awards,
Mhm.
and it's
Why do you have
interesting.
that?
I forget the exact one, but it's Iron Cross for bravery, and it's dated 1939. And it's interesting in that it's shiny, and it's been that way ever since we got it. I got it out of the People's Palace in Berlin, and we had it analyzed back at the steel company, and it's entirely different metal than they've ever used. And we should be trying
Well,
to
that's-
duplicate that today.
You got that as a souvenir, is that it?
Yes.
I see.
Here's another souvenir.
Mhm.
It's Hitler's award for German mothers for having babies for the Reich. It says Third Order of the Iron Cross from German mothers, signed by Adolf Hitler. And the date on it happens to be May 20th, 1945. Now some historian would say, wait a minute, Hitler committed suicide just before that. There's something wrong here. That has to be a fake. No, that's a real thing. And here's proof. Went back to that People's Palace again, I looked again, I found blanks with Hitler's signature on it to show that he made these, signed them ahead of time, and then they filled in the name and the date later on. So that's the reason that it could have been dated at a time after he died.
Can you tell us what these pictures are that you have?
Yeah, this is kind of interesting in this Salisbury Cathedral in England, and it's kind of, it's not very clear because this is German paper that we used. We had our own traveling photo lab, by the way, so that we could make pictures as we traveled. But there's little spots here, those are bombers, and there's about 14 of them in that picture right over Salisbury Cathedral, going over to bomb Germany. It shows some of the results of the bombing in Germany. This is the Siegfried Line tank trap. This happens to be 5 of our battery self-propelled 105 millimeter howitzers, usually fired. We never line them up like this. This is just for show. Some of the prisoners we captured, and we respected, we trained, we captured them and treated them just like we would be treated if we were captured by the Germans. Another bombing results in Berlin. This is a picture of our band that we had in Berlin and England. 10
Were you the
musicians.
band leader?
I was a saxophone player and leader, yes.
And are you still playing saxophone
No,
to this day?
I would like to, but the rehearsals are all at night. I don't care for that. This happens to be a picture of the Big Three. Here is Truman, Stalin, and Churchill. This is taken by an FBI man by the name of Anderson, and he asked us if we would process it, because as I mentioned, we had a traveling photo lab. We needed that because by the time you sent your film home, you'd probably...
Those are interesting pictures, and I see that some of them are duplicates of what you have here.
Oh, I bet you
Yeah.
are, yes.
We have only a few seconds left, so
All right.
I would like to wrap this up by saying that we really appreciate hearing your story. It is very interesting. and I am sure that you have much, much more that you could say.
Oh, yes. I wish I could remember more.
I think as you talk, then thoughts come to you, memories come back to
Yes,
you.
yes.
So is there anything you would like to say at the end?
Just that without the Lord's help and our family praying for us at home and our massive supplies coming from the United States and air superiority, we couldn't have won the war. Just couldn't have done it.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Coe. This has been
Thank you.
very, very interesting.
I enjoyed it.